Assalamu alaikum and good evening. My name is Yusuf Ismail and the program you're watching is I Beg to Differ. This program focuses on contemporaneous debate on socio-economic, political, cultural and religious issues affecting us as South Africans, and certainly looking at some of the dominant trends in the global community and its impact on society. Islamophobia. This term attained a new current in the 1970s, and in today's discussion and debate, we'll look at what this particular term entails, where does it come from, and how does it in fact originate. Well, joining me in the studios live, I'm joined by Adnan Rashid, who is a historian from the United Kingdom. He's also has done his particular master's at the School for Oriental and African Studies. Welcome, and I really appreciate your time with us today on ITV.
Thank you for having me.
Let me start off with this. Islamophobia has been a term that is currently used. It's kind of become the sort of dirty word in contemporary politics. Used pejoratively. Some people state used as a label to stop free speech. What does this term entail?
Islamophobia means irrational hatred or fear of Islam. This is the most basic understanding of the term Islamophobia. Of course, it has surfaced recently in political circles and international media where the term is discussed extensively. There are those who argue, as you rightly stated, that it limits freedom of speech. Possibly it's an attempt to limit freedom to criticize Islam. Others argue, no, Islamophobia is real. It does exist. People do hate Islam and Muslims. In some cases irrationally, in some cases deliberately.
The Runnymede Trust, I think the Commission on British Muslims and Islamophobia, I believe in '97, that was when the report basically introduced the term, defining it as anti-Muslim prejudice. Would you see it as anti-Muslim prejudice or more particularly anti-Islamic sentiment in the sense whereby someone basically demonizes the faith to the level that anyone that is associated with the faith basically is then by extension tarnished?
Anti-Muslim prejudice and anti-Islam rhetoric are both intertwined. Both these concepts are intertwined, because if you hate the root, you will hate the fruit. Okay, so the
argument that's presented is that they don't hate the Muslim.
Yeah.
It's basically the ideology that is targeted, and this is basically the argument. So they present themselves as not anti-Muslim per se, but anti-Islam. But inevitably, it's going to have a kind of a ripple effect. So you're going to see the next Muslim with a degree of suspicion.
Of course, it is not possible for you to hate an ideology and not hate its adherents, its followers. It is very difficult to make that distinction between the ideology and the followers. So inevitably, if you start to dislike or hate a particular ideology, you will start to look down upon those who follow it. And this is why Islamophobia contains hatred for Muslims as well as hatred for Islam.
What are some of the kind of causes and characteristics? If you look at, for example, recent events, would you say that it had kind of acquired a new crescendo after the 9/11 attacks? I know in your country, in the United Kingdom, in the 80s, I'm not so sure how old you were back then, but during the height of the Rushdie saga in 1988, there seemed to have been this kind of more, before 88 it was, Pakis, racism based on ethnicity and obviously race, nationalism. But subsequently after 88, there seemed to have been this kind of transmogrification, this change, when now the new bogeyman was in fact the Muslim. Do you believe that the Rushdie affair, by and large, kind of exacerbated this sort of phenomenon, or rather gave this creation to this new phenomenon?
I don't think it was Rushdie affair so much. It was definitely 9/11. After 9/11, Islamophobia was legalized. Not necessarily on paper, but it was considered normal. It was considered normal to insult Islam, to insult Muslims on mainstream platforms. One of the politicians in Britain, Baroness Saida Warsi, who was part of the Conservative Party, she stated that Islamophobia has passed the dinner table test in Britain. But that means it became normal after 9/11. 9/11 unfortunately was a huge catastrophe, not only in human history, in the history of modern politics. and it changed the dynamics for Muslims globally. Unfortunately, Muslims faced a lot of hatred, a lot of attacks, and Islamophobia has now become a global thing. It's not local anymore to Britain. It is all over the planet. You can see it in Burma. The Buddhist monks are spreading hatred against Islam and Muslims. You see the Hindu right in India.
India, of course.
The BJP, Bajrang Dal and Shiv Sena and all these entities are spreading hatred against Muslims and Islam.
Far right in Europe, of course.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I mean, does that not just also, this is kind of a new fascism that seems to be emerging in European society.
Globally, I would say.
Is this a kind of inherent paranoid fear that is stoked up by the political leaders, the establishment, or the mass media, or possibly a combination of both?
Combination of both. It is the media as well as the politicians, and I believe the Muslims have a part to play in it as well. Of course, there are terror attacks taking place in conflict zones. One cannot possibly justify killing of the civilians, but there are atrocities committed in the name of Islam. But there is a political context to those atrocities. Those atrocities are not caused by Islam. They are caused by geopolitical events taking place in these regions. So the blame is not, Islam is not blameworthy for that. It is the political causes that are making these things happen. But because of those attacks, a lot of people are now able to say that because the culprits are Muslims.
It kind of sustains a prejudice, that negative stereotype that is superimposed on the Muslim masses is then sustained by saying, well, look, here are practical examples of what happened.
When it comes to prejudice, anti-Muslim prejudice, it is not a recent phenomenon.
Sure.
It goes back all the way to Middle Ages.
Absolutely.
Okay. It started with the Crusades.
Peter the Venerable, John of Damascus, for example, his writings, and what subsequently happened in the century, and it kind of, and we're gonna unpack that as we go along. But I just want to, how does one make then, because this then will be the issue that is raised, and certainly in academic circles, how do you basically discern, for example, unnecessary attacks against Islam from genuine critique on the Islamic faith? What in your particular, to say, if this is a standard to say, look, this is a genuine critique on Islam, which may be viewed as possibly anti-Islamic sentiment, but not necessarily Islamophobic. So how do you basically discern between the two? Political rhetoric and genuine critique?
That's a very good question, and that distinction must be made for the betterment of human development. Criticism is good, we welcome it, and even the Prophet of Islam had no problem with criticism. By the sheer fact that the Christians didn't believe in him as a prophet of God, that in itself is a rejection of his message, right? But that doesn't mean those people who reject the message of Islam deserve persecution. The Prophet never persecuted Christians who lived under his domain. He never persecuted Jews. When he did have wars with Jews, those wars were caused by, again, political events that took place at the time. Some sub-tribes, they broke the treaties. So the point I'm making is that this distinction...
Islam has encouraged debate in a sense, and self-critique.
Absolutely.
The Quran, do they not consider, had they been open, they would have found there many discrepancies. So it challenges you to question it. But here's the thing, that there's a very thin line to kind of veer on either side. For example, critique of the Prophet Muhammad. It can degenerate into polemic. So what is that kind of demarcating line to say, look, this is now Islamophobic sentiment, and this is genuine inquiry and genuine critique?
You see, this question goes back to the issue of freedom of speech. What does it actually mean to have that freedom? Do we have freedom to insult others? Do we have freedom to criticize? Freedom of speech, what does it actually mean? What are the limits? Where do you draw the line? So as Muslims, as a Muslim researcher, as a Muslim student of history, I have this opinion that criticism of Islam is welcome. We don't have a problem with criticism. Academic criticism conducted in decent civil language, we have no problem with that. We welcome that. Islam encourages it. In fact, we have examples throughout the Islamic civilization where scholars criticized Islam openly. They published books within the Muslim domain, and those books were disseminated throughout the Islamic empire, and Muslim scholars wrote rebuttals, they wrote responses. So if this freedom was not there throughout the Muslim empire or the Muslims, the history of Muslim civilization, we wouldn't have these works in existence.
The incoherence of the philosophers, for example.
Exactly.
And the response and counter-rebuttal.
No, the works of Al-Kindi. The works of Al-Kindi.
Yeah.
There were other critics of Islam living in Baghdad, in Cordoba, in Damascus. Christians flourished throughout the Islamic empire during the Golden Age, the so-called Golden Age. So we have no problem with criticism which is conducted in decent language without insults. Now, insults in Islam, or according to Islamic view, are not allowed because insults often lead to violence. Okay, this is why what happened in Europe in the 20th century, I believe it was because of freedom to insult.
The kind of demonization of the Jews in
that
Nazi
dehumanizes
Germany,
people,
dehumanizing them.
Yes,
and I believe even in your country, in the 50s, there's some sort of demonization of the Mau Mau, which led to the British massacring close to 50,000 Mau Mau in Kenya.
Yes.
So demonization results in inherent violence.
Yes, absolutely. What happened in Namibia, for example,
with the Hereros.
Exactly. There are so many examples of genocide in the 20th century that, and if one looks at the causes of these genocides, one sees insults and dehumanization that follows on from those insults. So this is why freedom of speech, freedom to criticize, freedom to highlight weaknesses in another faith or in another person that represents that faith is perfectly fine with Muslims and Islam and in any decent society for that matter. But freedom to insult should not be allowed and is not allowed in any civilized society on the planet.
I think the British futurist Ziauddin Sardar, you may have heard of him, pointed out, I think in the height of the Jalan's Postens cartoon in 2006, the point he made quite interestingly in respect to freedom of expression was that when freedom of expression is used in the fashion that it is used by groups like Charlie Hebdo, Jalan's Posten, against minority communities, it effectively becomes a tool of oppression.
Absolutely.
Because the very basis for free speech and free expression was giving the masses the ability to critique and basically express their dissent against the ruling class. When it is used against minority populations, as it was used against the Jews in Nazi Germany, Muslims, then it becomes a tool of oppression. So I think that's a clear demarcation, a distinction we need to make. But before we continue, we'll have to go for a quick ad break, and we'll be back shortly. Welcome back to I Beg to Differ. I'm your host, Yusuf Ismail, and with me in the studios, I'm joined by an astute historian from the United Kingdom, Adnan Rashid. Welcome back, Adnan. When we went on a break, I just want to take us up further. When you look at some of the kind of issues that basically are viewed as Islamophobic elements, I've got a writing by an academic. Academics still debating the legitimacy of the term, but these are some of the issues that they point out which falls under the rubric of Islamophobia and can be categorized in the Islamophobic sentiment. For example, the idea that Islam is seen as a monolithic block. Muslims are seen as monolithic. It is seen as separate and other, inferior to the West, seen as violent, aggressive, threatening, supporting terrorism, a clash of political ideology, which I think Samuel Huntington kind of also popularized. And the fact that anti-Muslim sentiment is seen as natural and in fact normal. But a lot of these issues, the monolithic, the issue of the other out there, how much of that is internalized by Muslims and by Muslim societies?
In what sense? Are you talking about from the Muslim perspective?
In the sense, for example, that when you look at many of the countries, a lot of these countries, be in the Muslim world, be they, for example, in the Saudi Arabia, be they, in the time of the Afghan ruling by the time, a lot of them were in fact repressive, did not allow free political thought, the ability to think, question the state. Even insofar as practice of your religion, if you go to Saudi Arabia, you can't just go and deliver a lecture. It's state regulated. And a lot of that basically creates an indication that this is static, cannot change, cannot move, inflexible, intolerant, and that is now postulated as part and parcel of Islamic culture in a sense?
That's a very good question, and some of these criticisms are actually legitimate. There is no doubt that we find these problems in Muslim lands. In particular, some of the countries you have mentioned, there is definitely, there are limits to freedom. One cannot criticize regimes or the rulers in these countries, and that leads to problems.
Not just religion, I mean the Khashoggi case and
Yes.
Raif Badawi, I mean a lot of these individuals, but
Yes.
some of them obviously criticize the faith itself,
Yeah.
which is, but the state is autocratic, dictatorial dictatorships basically, and this goes throughout the world,
Yes.
throughout the parts of the Muslim world.
It's not part of Muslim culture to behave like that. There's no doubt that, of course, the state wants to have control. Every state wants control. At the same time, there has to be a balance between control and freedom to express dissent, right? And there should be limits to dissent as well. If dissent leads to rebellions, anarchy, like what happened during the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring started as a noble movement, seeking freedom, seeking jobs, seeking better economic provisions, but then it turned into terrorist enterprises.
It was misappropriated.
Absolutely, it was hijacked, and if it turns into that, then it is discouraged.
Could we say the same thing happened in Syria, where there was a legitimate struggle against a dictatorship?
Yes.
And then you had this kind of the struggle, the legitimacy of the struggle appropriated by groups like ISIS, Daesh, and all these other particular
Absolutely.
factions.
Then when these kind of groups come in and they hijack the movement, then the movement loses its legitimacy. So it is a very difficult balance to strike. One cannot always predict as to what direction a movement would take in future. So for this reason, Islamic scholars generally discourage rebellion, what we call in the Arabic language khuruj, against the authorities. It is based upon the study of history. It is based upon experiments of the past. Whenever a people rebelled against a ruler, in most cases they were destroyed. Because rulers generally have a lot of power, they have armies, they have militaries. Now dynamics have changed in this day and age. What we saw in Syria was absolutely devastating. The entire country has been razed to the ground. Yeah, absolutely.
One of the strongholds of Islamic studies in Damascus at some point in time.
Absolutely.
Totally
Thankfully, Damascus is still pretty much intact, but Aleppo has been completely decimated, unfortunately, and we have lost a lot of our history, libraries, Iraq war, Yemen, the situation in Libya. It has been counterproductive. So Muslims have to rethink their civilization. Muslims have to reassert their golden age. Muslims have to win hearts by working extra hard to make this very point that we are a very civilized people and we can do it. We can do it. We can lead the world in all important matters such as education, literature, science, technology, production. Most importantly, manners, akhlaq. Islam came to perfect akhlaq, manners and ethics. The greatest achievement of Muslim civilization was not scientific advancement or technological excellence.
Interhuman skills, interpersonal skills, which is the most important.
Exactly.
And we're lacking in that regard. And the tragedy of the whole lot is that sometimes both on the rebellion side and on the leadership justify their position on religious terms. I mean, for example, the countries and leaders that do not want rebellion, that appeal wrongly to the Quran, Ati Allah wa Ati Rasul, ulul amri minkum, that you obey Allah and His Rasul and those established with authority over you.
Absolutely.
And they would appeal to that, and then those who rebel. So it seems that both play off against each other.
You see, ruler and ruled relationship is reciprocal in Islam. Okay, there's a balance. The ruler cannot abuse his power. At the same time, the ruled, they cannot always rebel against the ruler every time they disagree, because there are many wisdoms behind that, because they don't always have the information the ruler has. You know, the files on the table of the ruler, someone who is managing the state, you don't always have that information. You don't know how these decisions are made by the rulers, and sometimes you may not agree with the decisions, but you don't always have the information. Likewise, the rulers, sometimes they don't know what the ruled the masses are going through. They don't have an idea.
Totally,
They're detached.
total disconnect.
Yeah, they have the palaces, they have the parties, they have the private jets.
Would you see? Just sorry to interrupt. Would you see that? Would you see a dictatorial monarchy as an aberration within the Islamic worldview in terms of, you know, the Quran does not necessarily prescribe styles of rulership,
Yes.
and even the word Khilafah is used in a generic sense, vicegerent successor in the Quranic sense. But would you see a monarchy, for example, as an aberration?
Not necessarily. I don't think monarchy in itself is an aberration. I think how it is conducted, how it is handled can be problematic. If a king is a just king and he's ruling by rules of Islam and he is ethical in his dealings with the people, then he is perfectly justified, Islamically speaking. The scholars of Islam have made it very clear that because all of these systems in the past, the Umayyad Empire,
Sure.
the Abbasid Empire, they were actually monarchical.
They were monarchical.
Yeah. So
But prior to that period, and you're going way back to the Khulafa Rashideen,
Yeah.
There's no classical Islamic precedence for the monarchy. It's very much during the time of the rise of the Abbasid Empire, and then, obviously earlier than that, the Umayyads, and then the Ottomans.
Yes.
But in the early Islamic period, we don't see any kind of absolute rule by means of succession. It was very much shura, mutual consultation,
Absolutely.
ijma, consensus of the community, not
That's
just
correct.
the elite.
So the ideal Islamic system is based upon the shura system, Ahlul Halli wal Aqd, the learned of the society, the elite of the society. The first question is, who are the elite of the Islamic society? They're not businessmen, they're not generals necessarily, they are the people of knowledge. They are the people who understand societies, who have taqwa, who have good characters. These are the people known as Ahlul Halli wal Aqd in Islam, the elite of Islam, right? They are the ones who choose, ideally, a ruler. But if a ruler overpowers the masses, he comes to power by force, by using his tribal force or by using his private militias or militaries. If he comes to power, as long as he's governing with justice and he is not a tyrant who is committing mass murders and imprisoning people unjustly, then the scholars of Islam encourage submission over rebellions. And this is again, this is not necessarily a quietist position. This is a practical, more pragmatic position, Islamically speaking, that if someone wants power and he or she has come to power, then they should be allowed to prove their worth. If in the long run they are not worthy, then there are procedures in Islam one can follow, and the scholars of Islam decide. Yeah. But one point must be made here, that if people feel that the ruler is not doing his job, then they must always consult the scholars of the land. Instead of taking things into their own hands. The Arab Spring is a huge example. The people came on the streets and they were shouting.
Someone immolated himself for not being able to sell veg, and then it spread subsequently.
Yes.
From Algeria.
No, one of the slogans, I don't know if you remember, the slogan of the people in all these countries was Ashab yurid isqat al-nizam. Literally translated, the people need or want the dismantling of the system. Okay, but they were not saying ma ba'd al-isqat. What comes after the dismantling of the system? They were not clear.
The alternative was not presented.
Exactly, it was not.
So you don't have an alternative. You break down the system, and there's no alternative.
And once you break the existing system, then all hell breaks loose. In Libya, people are getting raped. They're getting robbed.
It's still happening at the present point.
Yes, absolutely. In Syria.
In Egypt, you have something similar that's happening as well.
In Egypt, at least you have a government, albeit oppressive. There is a government, there is a president, there is an army. And if Egypt went the same way Syria went, it would have been a huge catastrophe for this ummah. So we should work within the system to change things politically rather than causing chaos. Sometimes chaos
destroys more than it actually builds up. And
There's
this kind of imaginary facade that is basically presented out there, but there's no real alternative. Okay, just veers us, and this has opened so much of debate around this, and I don't want to go off topic, but coming back to the aspect of Islamophobia, would you see some of the roots of Islamophobia in Orientalism? For example, in 1978, the noted Edward Said published his book Orientalism.
Absolutely.
in a general sense, basically referred to patronizing Western attitudes towards Middle Eastern, Asian, North African societies, but in particular Islam. Would you see Orientalism as kind of the, the predecessor or leading up, forerunner to what we see as Islamophobia today? Would Orientalism have had a major contribution, in other words, in shaping ideas, shaping opinions, shaping public policy? A lot of these individuals had William Mere, for example. He was quite politically influential, I believe, in India as well at some point in time. And this then basically led to what we see today. What would your take be
I
on that
agree
issue?
100% that Orientalism is, classical Orientalism is directly behind Islamophobia as we know it today. Because Orientalism justified hatred towards Islam and Muslims or Eastern cultures for that matter intellectually. So the Orientalists were the intellectual inspiration.
Could the argument not be made that it was a legitimate critique? I mean, a lot of the books, biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, you look at people like Alois Sprenger, Theodor Noldyk and so on. Their views are that, look, we were just criticizing the Islamic worldview, the Prophet. This was a legitimate critique from our side.
You see,
what's the counter response
the
to
critique is not a problem, because these Orientalists, the ones you mentioned, William Muir, Sprenger and Noldyk and Goldziher and others who were writing in the 19th century, some of the critiques of Islam were legitimate. They were raising valid points. In fact, they have done a huge service to Islam and Muslims by bringing some points to light, and we were able to do research on those points, and we were able to respond in due course. But other critiques of Islam led to persecution of Muslims, not only during the colonial period, but those ideas are still being used by the Islamophobia industry. By the way, Islamophobia industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry, globally speaking. There are Islamophobes working full-time in the US, and they have they are immune. They're working with impunity. There are no restrictions.
Would this be funded more from the right, the far right, as opposed to the far left?
That's right.
The left?
That's right. Absolutely, 100%.
Because the general critique they seem to be making is that the left has been pro-Islam in a sense. Well, basically, there seems to be this kind of schizophrenic partnership, and it's actually the right, the far right, that sustains and underpins this whole entire industry.
Yes, indeed. And the rise of the far right is directly linked to Islamophobia. If you study the rise of the far right in the US or in Europe, the rhetoric, just like it was during the 1940s, against the Jews in Germany.
It's almost similar. It parallels that.
In some cases, is exactly the same. The same language that was used against the Jewish people is being used today against the Muslims. And who is using this language? The far right.
I'm going to stop you at that. We'll come back and explore this further, and we'll be back shortly. Welcome back to our Beg to Differ, and today, this evening, we're discussing this pernicious phenomenon of Islamophobia and what it entails and its impact on Muslim societies. We discussed a lot of issues, and we went into the aspect of Muslim leadership, and now more particular Orientalism. When it comes to Orientalism, the kind of core aspect of their material, their research, that has become so prominent and certainly existing in our circles nowadays in the academic sphere, was the biography of the Prophet Muhammad. And essentially, when it comes to the core of the attack, there's a saying, you can attack Allah, you can attack Muslims, you can attack Islam. When you attack the Prophet Muhammad, that's something that is dearest to the Muslim. That has been the main target. So when it means attacking Islam, you attack it at its fundamental, the Prophet Muhammad, the biographies of the Prophet Muhammad that basically emerge. You look at some of the writings. William Mere, in the 1900s, you had Orientalists, some would say more objective scholars, people like William Montgomery Watt. Prior to him, you had, as we mentioned, Theodor Noldyk, Alois Sprenger, and so on. a lot of their material that they produced and the negative sentiment that was expressed in their reconstructionist biographies of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, in fact, they drew a lot from Muslim sources or from mainstream Muslim sources. One of them, obviously the earliest, or what we have, the recension by Ibn Hisham, Ibn Ishaq, which I believe Guillaume, Alfred Guillaume, translated in the 1950s, a thick book published by Oxford University Press. A lot of that material is indeed questionable. And in fact, Guillaume, in his translation, not just incorporated the material of Ibn Hisham, but also added additional material from Ibn Jarir Tabari.
Great service.
And he kind of put that all together. But a lot of the material is questionable there. There is a lot of material questionable. We don't necessarily have to go stories like about the story of Kirfa and what happened in certain of the battles, Asma bin Marwan and so on. A lot of these incidences that allegedly occurred have been questioned by, for example, people like Shibli Nomani or Hussein Haykal.
Or hadith authorities.
All these. And even the hadith, for example, many of the muhaddithin have questioned the legitimacy of these particular stories. So the negative picture and the portrait that was painted by these Orientalists, could one then make the argument that at some level it could have been drawn from these sources, from the classical Muslim source?
Yes, but a lot of these classical Muslim sources have been criticized by Muslim authorities themselves, as mentioned by yourself rightly, that some of the hadith authorities have clarified that a lot of these reports in chronicles, in biographies of the Prophet, and even in some of the early chronicles of Islam, they are dubious. A lot of these stories are dubious. They were made up. In some cases, they are outright forgeries.
Just on that point, maybe people don't know, is that when you look at someone like Ibn Jarir Tabari, these were primarily chroniclers. They were not scholars.
No, there was.
I think, I think it may have been possibly Hussein Haykal, I'm not so sure, I can't recall now, pointed out the fact that essentially these were chronicling information, reconstructing them, but not engaging in the kind of scholarly work that a historian in modern day period would be, the kind of critical historical method that would be applied. They never applied that.
Ibn Jarir Tabari was a great scholar, no doubt. He wrote the tafsir of the Quran, and he was a highly learned individual, there's no doubt about that. But the purpose of his collection was not to collect authentic information. He did not filter out authentic from inauthentic. What he did was, he wrote this history which runs into volumes. In the preface he made it very clear that I have collected authentic as well as inauthentic information in my chronicle. So it is up to the scholars to separate the authentic from inauthentic. So he simply collected information. He edited information, he put it under chapter headings, and whatever reports he could find on those particular chapter issues or chapters, he put them under those headings. And then later on, scholars, by their hard work, they separated authentic from inauthentic. So Tabari was not necessarily collecting authentic information like Bukhari was in his collection. So the purpose of Bukhari's collection was to separate inauthentic
wheat from the chaff.
Exactly. So this is why in Bukhari, what you find in Bukhari is 99% authentic. It is transmitted via chains of narrations, and we can see every single individual who's in the chain, and we can study the history of these respective individuals and reach a firm conclusion on their authenticity. Tabari also put chains in some cases, and in other cases there are no chains. In those cases, the story is there. You can take it as one of the possible interpretations or outcomes of the incident he's narrating, but not necessarily authentic. Not necessarily
on a
authentic.
scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate Ibn Hisham? At least the recension.
I would say Ibn Hisham contains highly authentic information, and it contains highly dubious information. No doubt, the scholars of hadith have made it very clear. Ibn Ishaq, the original author of Ibn Hisham's recension of Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Ishaq himself was highly questioned by hadith scholars. He was not inauthentic, I don't think so, but again his purpose was not to collect authentic information. Rather, what he did was he collected all the available important available information on the life of the Prophet to write a systematic biography of the Prophet. So while doing that, he included some highly dubious information, and he knew He lived in a very different age, you see. He didn't live in the 21st century.
I
where
think
people,
that's the point, is that the kind of historical anachronism where we want to superimpose a 21st century lens on writings that exist in the 8th and the 9th century.
Exactly.
That's a fundamental problem. And also, we spoke about earlier that the tendency to, for example, exaggerate battles or, for example, exaggerate killings, it served a specific literary purpose.
That's right.
In Islamic history.
Yeah, for information purposes.
For information purposes.
That this report has reached us. And you see, the point I was about to make was that those ages were different. People were highly scholarly, right? So those people who were reading the biography, they knew exactly what was dubious and what was not. So today, people are not necessarily able to separate authentic from inauthentic. This is why we go back to scholars. Coming back to Orientalists, Orientalists had a number of different motives. Some of them, in fact, all of them who were writing in the 19th century, naturally had their colonial Western prejudice. So they actually
they saw it from that bias.
That's right.
And they utilized this material and amplified it.
And Edward Said picks on that.
He picks on that
and he makes this point very clearly. That's one book I recommend that every Muslim.
Orientalism by
Orientalism.
Edward Said.
Yeah, exactly. He makes this point very eloquently.
There was an earlier book before him calling itself Islam and the Orientalists. I can't recall if you.
Yes, Maryam Jamila.
No, not Maryam. It may have been Maryam Jabila or A.R. Kidwai. I cannot recall the author of that, but just before that, and then there was a Venture of Islam by Marshall Hodgson, but that focused primarily on.
And there is another one, Tibawi.
Tibawi.
Yes, that's right. Islamic. He criticized Guillaume's translation as well.
Have you been to Guillaume's translation, or you've been to the original Ibn Hisham?
Yes.
Would you find that questionable?
I think the earlier point I was making was that Orientalists unwittingly did some great service to Islam and Muslims as well. Not all their work in translating some of the classical texts, in editing some of the stuff for us. Some of the texts were completely unknown. They were lost in libraries, and Orientalists, through their hard work, of course, the motives are not.
They spent a lot of time on that. I mean, even though some had questionable motives, Arthur Jeffrey, for example. He went through the Kitab al-Masahif of Ibn Abi Dawud. James Robson translated Mishkat al-Masabi. So there was a lot of effort, but that effort came with.
But in the process, Brother Yusuf, I would like to mention this very important point, that some of the Orientalists actually got Islamified while they were studying Islam, to criticize it, to find.
Who were the examples?
A.J. Arbery is a very good example. Ignaz Goldziher, who spent years.
He was focused on hadith criticism.
That's right. And he spent years in Egypt, and he used to pray with Muslims in Al-Adhar. He writes in his own writings, in his own memoirs, that there was a time when he was praying, he started to cry.
Wow.
Uncontrollably, he started to cry while he was praying Salah with Muslims. So a lot of the Orientalists got highly affected by what they were studying, what they were looking into. Some of them came to Islam. Mahmud Pictol was an Orientalist originally. Muhammad Asad was actually an Orientalist.
And Leopold Weiss, when he was with the front.
Exactly. Spent time with Muslims and came to Islam. So there are a number of examples one can cite in this regard. Most of the work, of course, was negative, no doubt, because some of them were Christian missionaries, like William Muir, who was a very important figure in India. He was a political administration.
His primary biography on the life of Muhammad was the one that basically is a prime work in English literature. I can't recall, there may have been something earlier than that. There were works earlier than that. But in terms of his biography, that's viewed as quite authoritative, was viewed for a number of years in missionary circles.
No, it has been completely.
Back then, authoritative. Now, certainly it's been outdated
and works go back as far as the 17th century.
Humphrey Prideaux basically wrote the life of the imposter. I can't recall the entitled.
The reality of imposter.
The reality of the imposter.
I have an original copy of that. 1697 it was printed.
1697.
Yeah. Then Amazing. Simon Oakley, 1708. Simon Oakley
in the 1700s. Sure.
Yes, 1708. Then came another author, I forgot his name, but Edward Gibbon also wrote in the Decline of the Fall of the Roman Empire. He wrote about the Prophet. Then we had there were apologies. There were apologies as well. There was John Davenport, an apology for Muhammad.
Carlyle, for example, the chapter on heroes and hero worship. So there were apologies at the same time. But which was quite interesting, particularly at a time of hostility. we're running short for time. I want to take you further to now, recent years. In the 70s, in the academic sphere, there seemed to have risen this new revisionist school of thought that basically focused on the idea that Islam as a system, the Quran, evolved over the next 200-300 years. But I'm just being told we have to go for an ad break. So when we come back, I'm going to leave you on that thought, and we'll be back shortly. Welcome back to I Beg to Differ. We're in the final segment, and today we're discussing and debating the phenomenon of Islamophobia. Adnan, when we went on a break, I focused on a question, we never obviously got to it, the kind of revisionist school, this new movement. You studied at the University of London.
That's right.
And this new revisionist movement within Islamic studies originated at the School of Orientalist and African Studies. I believe John Wansbrough in 1977 wrote Quranic Studies and then followed that up with the sectarian milieu. And you had some of his students like Horting, Patricia Crone, Michael Cook, Andrew Rippon, for example, Norman Calder. These were his prime students. Back then they were doing their thesis. But this basically postulated a new idea, and what some would be viewing as a kind of a new form of Islamophobic Orientalism, which created the idea that historically Islam stood on very shaky grounds. You cannot trace back the Quran to the 6th century. The life of the Prophet Muhammad was very much a kind of an amalgamation of stories that developed over a particular period of time. Geographical locations point to Petra and so on and so forth. What gave rise? I'm curious to know. I understand Wansbrough theorized. He never came to any kind of conclusions. What gave impetus to this whole new notion that developed?
Again, I think it is due to a prejudice, whether it's Western imperial prejudice or whether it is dislikeness of Islam, or whether it is a succession of Orientalism, classical Orientalism. It has a number of causes and reasons, but it did become very prominent recently, not very long ago, as you mentioned, in the 70s and the 80s. The revisionist school was running the show in Western universities. Patricia Crone was very popular. And then
You've never met Patricia, have you?
I have never met her, but I have read some of her works, and I found them to be historically rich, no doubt. She put in a lot of information in her works.
She studied, was she able to read 15 different languages?
Yes, she was a very good scholar, no doubt. When I say scholar, she was a very good researcher, no doubt. But her conclusions were, in most cases, far-fetched. There is a scholar called Sargent who wrote an article on her theory on Mecca. That
Meccan trade and the rise of Islam. It was a kind of a refutation.
Exactly. She had this opinion that Mecca didn't actually exist.
It wasn't a central trading route.
Right.
And unknown.
She even doubted the current location. Yeah. She was trying to cast doubt on the current location. She was saying that Mecca, basically her argument was that Mecca was the doing of the Umayyads. It didn't actually exist in the time of the Prophet where it exists today. So that theory was highly criticized, challenged by people like Sargent and other traditionists, because there are two views on early Islam as far as historiography is concerned. Historians have two views. One is the revisionist view, which is actually on the back foot now.
It was a minority position,
and
it was a fringe theory,
yes.
And it's never entered the mainstream.
It has been on the back foot now. A lot of revisionists are embarrassed to be revisionists, and they have actually abandoned that.
Michael Cook, for example, was also a student. He's abandoned that position.
That's right. He was
totally.
He
co-authored Hagarism with Patricia Crone in 1977. But interestingly enough, one of these students of Wansbrough, John Burton, for example, Burton never fell into the revisionist school of thought.
And there are others. There are others who are recent scholars who have challenged revisionism, and they want to pursue more balanced approach, because with the rise of new evidence that's coming out of Arabia in particular, such as the inscriptions on the rocks, some of them have the names of the companions. Of course, there's a problem that one cannot always date them accurately, and the issue of forgeries is also there. But some of those inscriptions are dated. There is a science available to us called paleography. We can actually study the text and come to a firm conclusion as to when these texts were possibly written. Some of those texts are dated, for example, and they run into thousands. So there are recent studies being conducted as we speak right now that challenge the conclusions and the ideas or the ideals of the revisionist school directly. Okay, so based on this, a lot of modern historians such as Robert Hoyland and Hugh Kennedy and Carol Hillenbrand, they are challenging revisionism for its bigotry and
Nikolai Sinai. Nikolai Sinai.
Yeah, I think he's balanced. He's quite balanced.
Nikolai
Yes.
Sinai,
Yeah,
Fred Donner.
Yes.
Because there's this new. Did the revisionist thought kind of move into, for example, discussions on the evolution of the Quran? People like Kharpoun, when he was in fact commissioned by the Yemeni government, right, to conduct tests on the Sana'a palimpsest. But he postulated the idea that the palimpsest was slightly different and kind of modern day missionary tautology tries to draw onto this kind of material, popularize that, and then brings it into the mainstream.
That's right.
That's basically what seems to be happening. Even though within the academic sphere it's fringe, it's a minority, it's not viewed as it's viewed as suspect. But it's popularized now, and every Tom, Dick, and Harry, and I think you've come across them all the time, popularize them into the public mind, and people really have no idea about the nuances of these particular theories.
Thankfully, missionaries have no stature within the academic circles when it comes to studying early Islam or even later Islam for that matter. The missionaries are generally ignored, even if they manage to get PhDs, because of if they are open about their bigotry and they are open about their very prejudiced view on Islam, they are not given much attention in academic circles.
So it undermines the credibility, because then a fringe academic theory is used as a polemic for missionary purposes.
Yes, that's correct.
Which obviously places a great degree of credibility, questions the underlying credibility of your entire mission towards Muslims. Is this now becoming, is this falling away into the wayside? Are people calling them out on the kind of, the lack of credibility behind this kind of information that is available?
Yes, and I think Muslims need to up their game. We need to come forward. We need to start studying Islam, early Islam, the Middle Ages, the Golden Age. We need to highlight these prejudices where they exist, and we need to study and master our own fields. We need to become the teachers of Islam.
Why are there so few Muslims studying Quranic manuscripts?
Unfortunately, Muslims are lacking.
We've got two. I mean, Ikmaluddin Ihsanoglu and Tayara Altikulic,
the Turkish scholars. Yes,
the Turkish scholars, but as really well known. But besides, and then of course there's Bahnam Sadeghi from the United States. I believe he's based in the States. But besides these few names, the vast majority of those who studying classical Quranic manuscripts and classical Islamic history are non-Muslims.
Yes, correct. And this is because most Muslim scholars who do qualify from traditional institutions are busy writing sectarian works. They're busy attacking each other.
That's a problem. The sectarianism that existed in the Indo-Pakistani subcontinent is then exported to India, from India to South Africa. It exported to your country, the United Kingdom. I'm not so sure how deeply embedded you are in sectarian divisions, but it seems in the traditional so-called Darul Ulooms, which should be the forerunners, foremost in this kind of research.
Of Islamic intellectual activity. 100% Darul Ulooms, the ulama, the scholars need to take a lead. And when they do...
Are they too far behind to take a lead now?
Unfortunately,
is it too late?
No, it's not too late. It's never too late. No. It takes literally 3 to 5 years to do a master's and a PhD in an academic subject, and you can become someone well recognized.
But incorporating that study in the traditional Darul Uloom setting, that's not done. You go to Darul Uloom, no one's going to study and look at, for example, well, I mean, you may possibly have discussions on the sciences.
But it can be. What we can do is, if we add, or if we get our Darul Ulooms accredited by international institutions, if we turn them into seminaries and give PhDs in theology, give PhDs in Quranic studies, and do them in the English language in particular, then we will make a huge difference. So our ulama, our Maulanas, our scholars need to, of course, think deep about it. We need them to come forward and take leadership in this and give academia some attention so that our youngsters, the future generation, can look up to them and seek inspiration from them.
Do you find the Islamic educational curriculum wanting?
Yes. I think we need to make few changes, not change it entirely, not a reform, rather a revival of the classical Islamic literature. You remember back in the day, Muslims dominated the world for over 1,000 years in the field of education. The Arabic language was the lingua franca of the world. Muslim authors were the best authors in the world. Muslim scientists, Muslim philosophers, Muslim poets, you name it, Muslims led the world in academia to an extent where Europeans were actually traveling to the Muslim lands to seek knowledge, like we travel today to Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, Durham.
It was the opposite way around.
The tables have been turned, and they can be turned again. Similarly, we have millions of Muslims living in the West. I believe they should go to Western universities, having studied Sharia, having studied Islam, and I think Maulanas are the best people qualified to do so. They should go into Western universities, get these degrees in so-called secular sciences, or in particular humanities, and lead the world, lead the Muslim community.
In terms of knowledge.
In terms of knowledge and intellectual activity, and even dealing with questions like Orientalism, Revisionism, and Islamophobia, and prejudice against Muslims. We need leadership in the West. We need people to speak for us. Yeah.
If you would have a magic ball, what would your prediction be? Looking, I mean, that's the ideal. That's what we would like. What would your prediction be in terms of where we stand at this point in time?
I look at things optimistically, and I believe, although we are getting closer to the day of the day of Qiyamah. Yeah, as a Muslim, I believe that. But as far as Muslims are concerned, things are getting better now. Muslims have woken up globally. They have realized that there is a problem. We are being mistreated globally. There are no two opinions about that. Even the governments are speaking up now. People like Tayyip Erdogan and Imran Khan, leaders who are speaking up, and they're realizing there is something wrong. Enough is enough. So Muslims are waking up, generally speaking. The youth is waking up, and the future looks good.
If there's, in your last 30 seconds, if there's, for example, an advice to the ordinary layman, you can call him the da'i, how the best to combat Islamophobia, what would your advice be?
Start studying.
Start studying.
Start studying. Study your history carefully and see the achievements of the Muslims, the Muslim civilization, and you will know exactly how to defend it.
Adnan Rashid, I want to thank you for this discussion. It's been great having you for the first part of our discussion. Really appreciate your time. Look forward to having you back. And that's all we have for now, folks. We've been discussing Islamophobia. I will not attempt to make a summary of the discussion this evening, but join us next week for more hard-hitting debate as we explore other issues impacting on our community in South Africa and certainly in the global world. This is Yusuf Ismail, on behalf of ITV. Till next time, Assalamu alaikum and good evening.